Guys, I've been getting a lot of questions about how this new PvE mode actually works, as well as a lot of nuanced questions about like the specific stats and specific builds. So in today's video, we're going to briefly go over all the most very important things, and I'm going to explain exactly how all of it works, as well as how to utilize the entire system as you level up and progress through the difficulties of this new PvE mode. So as you progress through the difficulties, you will notice you start to get gear drops. And as you progress into Nightmare or Extreme or even hard, depending on who you are, maybe you'll find it to start to get kind of difficult. Usually, if you want to progress as fast as you can, especially if you want to be jumping ahead multiple Nightmare levels at a time, you need to make sure that whenever you get gear, you go to the Forge and you scrap the gear you don't like. So what you want to do is you want to go to your hero and you want to equip the best gear that you have. Then go to your Forge and start to select all the gear you don't need or you don't think you'll ever use. Now, as you're leveling, you don't need to be picky about your gear. In fact, you want to sell or scrap most of your gear, because as you level and you go through higher difficulty nightmares, you're going to get higher level gear that very quickly replaces your lower level gear. However, the gear is extremely important to make the progress easier. So as you level up, you then want to scrap the gear you don't need, go to the Forge, and craft the best gear you can for your level. Now, this is very, very important, because if you want to progress quicker, you want to craft only the best, most optimal gear for that level. Let's say you're level 14, and you're struggling on Nightmare, whatever, Nightmare 5, let's say. Level 14, and you're struggling on Nightmare 5. You're level 14, you're 2 levels away from being able to craft level 16 gear. Why would you spend all of your resources and craft level 8 gear, which might help you do Nightmare 5, when you could just go into Nightmare 4 or Nightmare 3, level up to level 16 pretty quickly, and then get a bunch more gear that you can then scrap and use to craft all your new gear. This will help you progress much quicker if you're saving all your scrap and spending in bulk on the best gear you can per level slot. Now, every hero has different stats in terms of what's the best things for you. However, one thing almost every hero has in common is the key traits you definitely don't want, especially early on. Now, as you get into later game, you might like some of these, maybe, but usually you don't ever want to go with these talents. So the first ones that you really don't want to go for is health. This is 70 points per attribute. It is very, very, very low, especially because later in the tree, you get percentage-based max health, which is a much better upgrade. As well as on gear, you'll eventually get gear like I have here, my chest piece, plus 100% max health, which saves you more talent points that you could use, because as you go up the difficulty, you start to get one-shot anyways, and damage is just so important because of how much it scales, that if you're doing really, really insane damage, you'll just breeze through. Now, if you plan on doing this solo, I would say you definitely want to max out the percentage max health tree, but you still don't want to go for the flat health, because 300 health on a max upgrade around there is just so low. It has such low value compared to the other traits. Total damage bonus, you want this the most because it does not get weaker as you get higher percent bonuses. With the total output boost, it does get a bit weaker, so you want to make sure you max this one out. Armor value, you do want to avoid this as well, but if you're going solo, you could put a couple of points into this, but generally it's pretty weak. Critical damage and pierce damage as you go down, these things will depend on your build, which I will get into very shortly. But again, I just want to go through right now very briefly the things you should avoid for starting off. You just want to be going for damage. Damage, 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 and the best things. Like block rate, you also want to avoid this. Early on, you just want to go for damage. So the thing I got the most questions about was the stats. And I will talk about every stat now and what it all does, because it's pretty confusing at times for some of them. So total damage bonus is the best one you could get, because total damage bonus is flat bonus damage, 50%. Right here, right? So you get 50% right here. That's flat 50%. No matter how high your total damage bonus percent goes, it's a flat 50%. So one of the best damage bonuses you can get on your gear is total damage bonus. Total output boost devalues as it gets higher. So it's extra, it's like total damage bonus, but as the total percent gets higher, as it says here, it gradually tapers off as the total amplification value increases. So if you had to choose between two pieces of gear, maybe one has slightly higher output bonus and the other one has just a little bit less total damage bonus, go for the total damage bonus because it doesn't taper off. Bonus damage against close range enemies. Depending on what build you're going for, it's not just if you're a ranged damage dealer or you're a close range damage dealer, because it says here within 5 meters. So if you're facing, for example, if you're on Blade but you're going for a sword build, you'd want to have this. But even if you're on Blade and you're going for a ranged build, you can still get value with this buff by just standing closer to the enemies as you damage them. Because sometimes you'll get a really, really good piece of gear that has a stat on it you might not prefer, like damage against close range enemies, but you can still get value out of it. Damage bonus against healthy enemies is against enemies that have their current health above 80%. Some people wrote in the comments it was 70%. No, it is 80%. For most builds in the game, this is a pretty crappy stat. I wouldn't really want to go for it. Primary weapon extra damage bonus. Again, this is mostly for your stat tree here, but you could get it on a sword, on a piece of gear too. It just buffs your primary weapon, which in this case is his sword and his shotgun. Ability extra damage is every ability your hero has, but it does also affect ultimates, okay? It does also buff your ultimate. So if you want to go for an ultimate ability on Blade, primarily a late game build, you can get the ability extra damage boost. Critical hit rate and precision rate. This is the biggest question people had. Critical hit rate and precision rate. So crit hit rate, as you guys all know, it's a chance to do a crit, which in this case, I have very high crit rate in my gear. I have 3,000% crit damage. So I have a 50% chance to do 3,000% more damage. Precision rate, on average, now my gear in my build, right, is leaning more towards the crit rate. If I had gear, specifically gear, that had higher amounts of precision damage. Like the reason I'm going for a crit rate build, it means in the talent tree, I'm avoiding the precision rate buffs, and I'm going for the crit rate buffs. You don't really choose which one you go for. You go for whichever one your gear allows you to, right? So if you look at my gear, the gear that I rolled, this one here has plus 600% crit damage. This one here has plus 16% crit rate and plus 400% crit damage. So my gear is leaning me towards crit damage. So when I go to my traits, I avoid the precision because my gear isn't really buffing that. And I go all in on the crit rate. That way, when I look at my buffs, now I have an insane value. I don't really care about the precision rate because my precision damage is low. I'm not going to put talents into precision damage because my gear is telling me to go for crit. They can't stack, so you can't land a crit and a precision hit. But on average, precision has a lower chance to hit, but a much higher damage boost. That's why sometimes if you see a orange crit, that means it's a precision hit. That usually does an insane amount of damage. So you don't really choose. You pick one based off what your gear is leaning you in towards. Maybe you can go half and half if your gear has a good amount of both. Some of these are pretty easy, like primary weapon, attack speed, ability cooldown reduction. Most heroes don't really want this, but there might be. I haven't tested all the builds yet. For Blade, boost ultimate ability charge speed. Most ultimates aren't that great. You don't really want to go for ultimate charge rate, but you could if you're going for an ultimate ability build. That's the only time you ever want to go for it. Survival. Most of these are pretty obvious, like the armor value, which will give you your armor damage reduction. Dodge rate is pretty much the chance to just avoid all damage. Now, looking at your talent tree, your armor also specifies for you which one you're going to be doing. So if you get armor that gives you a lot of block rate, let's say you get 2 pieces of armor that give you a lot of block rate, but none of your gear gives you dodge rate, you'd want to maybe put some points into block damage reduction. This is if you feel like you're having trouble surviving and you're looking at the different points in your tree and you think you have a couple to spare in defenses. Again, defenses are not a high priority in this game. They're really not. You really want to focus on damage. The highest priority thing you have here is just the health percent. However, if you want to try to tank your build, your gear will also determine for you which one you lean into, whether it's dodge rate, block rate, or block damage reduction. Block rate is just the chance that you trigger a block. So dodge rate is better, but it's a lower chance. Dodge rate, if you trigger it, you'll avoid the entire attack. Block rate, if you trigger it, you'll get 300 less damage on that instance of damage, so that singular hit. So multiple hits in a row can trigger it, which could save you a lot of health. And then these buffs here are just for your health and all those things. And then you get into the special skills, which you get from gear. So late game, this is where things get tricky. So as you get to around like Nightmare 80, somewhere around here, somewhere between like 60 and 80, once you get to this range, you really want to stop what you're doing and make sure if you're not already, you're level 60. This is the point where you start specializing in a build. So as you can see, if you look at my gear, you'll notice the ability buffs. This is where everything changes. This is where you go from early game builds to late game specialization. So the build I currently have equipped is a build you can only do late game. If you play Blade, you cannot do an ultimate ability build early game because it sucks. However, as you go and you hit level 60, you can start spamming the nightmares in between 40 and 70. You can just start spamming it, get tons of legendaries, keep getting your gear, and then scrap it and start crafting. You want to scrap all the stuff you don't need and then start crafting. Now, for late game, you want to sell everything that's not a legendary, because eventually you do get a lot of legendaries. Sometimes I get 4 in one run, and then you can go out and you can craft, and I'll get like, I even got 4 in one crafting, or I crafted 10 and I got 4. You get a lot of legendaries, and legendaries are just so much better than the epics that you get so many late game. You just want to make sure when you get to the end, you want to sell all your epics for the hero that you're playing that you have all the legendaries for. You want to sell everything that's epic and below, and then just keep farming the epics and the legendaries. And the legendaries will determine what build you go for. Now, I've been playing this a while, so I'm level 60 and I have a bunch of different builds because I have a bunch of legendaries. However, this is one example of a build you'd go for. Let's say you get a couple legendaries. So you see on this piece of gear, 2 buffs to my ultimate ability, which are very powerful. And then you also look on my weapon, another S tier buff on my ultimate ability. 3 buffs to my ultimate, on top of a bunch of close range damage and crit damage. Looking at that, I'm like, okay, I can do an ultimate ability build because this S tier buff is insane. Ultimate ability damage scaling based on the target's missing health plus 2700%. This now means I can go for a viable ultimate ability build on Blade. This is the most important thing about late game, is you need to specialize. You need to get a build and like, okay, I'm going to go for an ultimate ability build because I now have all the legendaries that are working towards it. So my gear is still not perfectly mid-maxed because, as you can see, my legendary accessory has a buff I'm not using. If I'm going with the ultimate ability build, I'm not using Daywalker Dash. So that's kind of useless. However, I'm using it because the crit rate and crit damage buff is huge, and I'm still trying to proc a legendary in the Forge that has an ultimate buff, because you can get ultimate buffs, or you can get the same buff that buffs the same ability on all your gear. So you can just have insane levels of specialization. Then you go to your traits and you specialize. And there's multiple builds for every hero. And the most important thing you need to remember, this most important thing, is that your gear determines what build you're going to go for. You might say I want an ultimate build, but if I go to my gear and all of my gear is Daywalker Dash or basic ancestral sword damage, I can't do an effective ultimate ability build. This is where the gear, you can get really creative with it too, because the gear is what's telling me right now to go a max crit damage and max crit chance build. It's also what's telling me to go for an ultimate ability build. So this is again where gear is so important, because without the legendary gear with all these procs, you can't really specialize. And this is the key to defeating Nightmare 70+. As you do late game, you need these builds to make it work. You just do. Same thing with Blade. If you're struggling on a hero, you're going with a normal build. Maybe you watched a guide. Maybe you watched my Blade guide, and you're going with the gun build. And you're like, you hit Nightmare 7, you hit a wall. This is where things change. I'm gonna make builds on late. I'm gonna make videos on late game Blade guides as well as some other heroes too soon. But there are late game builds that you can only do late game that you need the end game gear for. So it's very, very, very important that once you hit high Nightmare level, you get to level 60 and you start farming legendaries, and then you specialize, you hyper specialize. All right, guys, that's it for today's video. If you want more content on PvE, do let me know down in the comments what specifically you want to see as well, because there is so many different builds. Now, I'm only getting really, really deep into all the different builds you can do on Blade, but I know it's just the same as every hero. You can go all the way with so many different builds, and it gets so creative. I'm truly enjoying it, and I hope you guys are too. That's all for today's video. If you enjoyed, please remember to like, subscribe, comment, turn on the bell for notifications so you can see when my videos are. As always, guys, take care.